Father talk about holiness, wonder, awe, radical amazement. They're talking about religious experiences, but they're simultaneously talking about what it is to be a human being. Because they're asking us, what do we have in ourselves? What do we need to cultivate in ourselves to be able to experience something as holy? It doesn't come to us. You know, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. We make the Sabbath holy. We sanctify. What does it take to sanctify, to make something holy, to experience that march in Selma as a holy moment? That's the question we ask ourselves. And yes, and my father wasn't always solemn, and when he came back from Selma, he said that a little boy came over to him, because my father, you know, had a beard and white hair, and said to him, "Are you Santa Claus?" Very helpfully, I'm sure. Yes?
You spoke of moral emergency. You've also spoken about moral issues and moral dilemmas. What kind of connection is there between the moral emergency of the 60s and the moral dilemmas, moral issues that you deal with today?
So what is the link between the moral emergency of the 60s and today? I think the moral emergency of today is very clear, and I think that this country is not as united in its willingness to let our hearts be open to change. I think we are more hard-hearted than we realize, and I hear that hard-heartedness when I listen to some political leaders, for example, but also when I simply see what goes on in state legislatures, when I see what goes on in the streets and with the police, and we all see. There was a time in this country when people had postcards of lynchings, and they had them as souvenirs, and they passed them around, postcards of lynchings. And now we have videos of police shooting and killing and murdering innocent African Americans on the street, in the back, chokehold, shooting at North Charleston. Unbelievable. That's what we have. I would say, of course, I'm shocked, you're shocked, we're shocked. I would expect, with something like that, I would expect the whole government to scream in outrage. I would expect the whole world, this country, to change overnight to see something like that. Why hasn't it? So I think that yes, we do have moral emergency. I'm not sure how many of us proclaim it and realize it and declare it and scream about it and insist. Moral emergency means that the everydayness of government has to stop if this is what's going on. That there are transcendent values, the basic right to be alive, and not to be murdered on the street by a representative of the government that is a policeman. You want your government to kill you on the street? What is that? Yes?
Have you ever thought of becoming politically involved?
Mm-hmm.
To make those statements publicly and to maybe make a difference?
I think we all are politically involved.
But
I think
to really get that message across, it needs to be more public.
You know what I'm doing? No, I hope that I can convey something through my teaching, my students, my colleagues, my writing. Yes?
Me?
Yes.
Okay. I grew up in Tuskegee, Alabama, and particularly this time that you're talking about is very sensitive to me. I grew up at a time where in 1964 the governor of Alabama closed my school by sending state troopers around it and would not allow any of us to go to school. And my dad stood up for public education, stood up for people, stood up for the whole civil rights movement. And I think I have a better understanding now of what he was trying to say. Yes, it was a Christian, it was definitely Christianity. I mean, you know, all people were all humans. But the moral crises that I see so much more now, a lot clearer, and it's been a long time. But I, as a person whose family took up for equal rights of everybody, and I mean by that everybody, didn't matter who you were, felt that I went through a lot of people who never spoke to me again. You know, friends that I had grown up with had never spoken to me. And then when our parents died off, we all kind of got back, you know, where we could talk more. And so it was such a learning process, but this made it much, I think what you're saying has made it a lot clearer for me.
Good, thank you. Yes?
I'm a daughter of a Palestinian refugee from 1948. My father was Christian, as I am, and I married a Jewish American. So you can say peace of the Middle East.
So what?
We're sort of the peace of the Middle East. But he was a refugee, and this refugee crisis that we have today really hits hard for me, and I'm having a hard time reconciling with it, reconciling the situation, especially given that many governors have turned away. They don't want to take anyone, and I feel it's heartbreaking to see that. I wondered what you thought your father and Martin Luther King would say today about that situation.
Well, you know, my father came to this country as a refugee. He came in March of 1940, at the last minute, and he tried desperately to save his mother and 3 of his sisters, who were all murdered. And of course he wanted the doors to be open. And he was appalled by the indifference, by the complacency that he found among Jews in the United States. He was appalled by that. So what would he say? Of course, without question. He was a refugee. He knew what that was like. He knew how that felt. Yes?
I'm one of the docents at the Holocaust Museum, and some of you may have noticed a few weeks ago in the Chronicle that it was reported positively that Houston takes in more refugees than any other city in the country. And I think we're all very proud of that. But one of the things I've learned at the Holocaust Museum is the first country in Central Europe that gave exit visas to Jews was the only country in Europe that had a Muslim president, King Zog. I think it's important that we remember this now, that during the war, almost all of the Muslim leadership did not coalesce with the Nazis at all. There were a few exceptions, but if we look back at the history, at this particular critical time that we're in now, you know, the Muslim leadership did not coalesce with the Nazis. All of Northern Africa, if you go to Israel to this day, you see families that have pictures that came from Northern Africa, Jewish families, where they knew that the Muslim leadership did not coalesce. And you know, this is really, we're going to now see more of an attack on the many peaceful Muslims in this country. And unfortunately, our governor is one of the people that's precipitating this. He's one of the governors that said that he's not going to allow any Syrians.
Yeah, I think that's very important, and I also think it was very unfortunate that Prime Minister Netanyahu said foolishly and mistakenly that al-Husseini had given the idea to Hitler. It's not true, and it's an idea, by the way. It's a claim that was made by Nazis during the Nuremberg trials to try to blame it on al-Husseini, who, by the way, was not a nice person at all, but who was also not taken very seriously by his own fellow Muslims in his day. So yes, and let me just mention that I'm actually writing a book right now on the history of Jewish scholarship on Islam, because Jews in the 19th century viewed Judaism and Islam as sister religions, as two religions of ethical monotheism, which is really interesting. Yeah, but go ahead, please.
A question and I guess a comment kind of rolled together. It seems that participation in this country and society and the democracy is at such a low ebb. We don't, the famous book Bowling Alone, the Robert Putnam thing, we don't have civic engagement. We don't have civic participation. We don't have churches, parish, temple, synagogues, or mosques speaking out like they used to. We don't have that fierce urgency of now. We don't call it anything you want. We don't have any of that in this country. And in the little town 2 hours from here east, where your grandfather-in-law and my relatives endured the Klan together, when you had a beast at your door in your midst, you were forced to coalesce together as human beings against that beast. You had a common enemy. Maybe because we don't have that, because we live in a society of I and me and we and, as opposed to we and us. And it's the classic thing, if my ox cart is not in the ditch, then it's not my problem. And until it becomes all of our problem, and we see collective humanity as human beings, it doesn't seem we're going to move this equation at all. We're stuck. Somebody called it the other day, we seem to be stuck in our stupidity and happily stuck. Because materialistically, I'm okay. And so those who are suffering with poverty and oppression, inequities, inequalities, disparities that exist, it's not me. As long as it's not me, I can articulate that I care, but I take no action. I don't march with my feet. I don't pray with my feet. I say, oh, isn't that horrible, isn't how bad that is, but then I do nothing. I take no responsibility. And I guess that complacency, if you can call it that, is tearing us down more and more, because the I and me and the we and us divide is just growing more and more every day. There is no common ground. There is no compromise. There is no willing to compromise. And so where do you go in a society like that? We will not implode from outside. We're going to implode from within. And you see it happening slowly all around us. And we wouldn't have had that. The 60s, there was a crisis. Whether it was civil rights, whether it was the Vietnam War, whether it was the women's rights, you had a crisis. And so you had to you couldn't stand on the sideline. You had to get in the game or go home. Now, you can sit in your gated communities, you can sit in your safety and not get involved.
Yeah, I agree with you. You're right, and it is a terrible thing. I think we are happily stuck in our stupidity, as you say, and this complacency. And I guess what's so bizarre in part is that, you know, the basic lesson from Hegel, from the phenomenology of mind, that I am only an I if I am recognized by you. Your recognition of me is what constitutes myself, who I am. I need to be recognized. I need to be known and acknowledged by another person, or I don't exist. Nobody ultimately has any identity at all. You are an empty shell unless you are known and recognized. And that's such a basic lesson that runs throughout modern thought, philosophy, and Hegel articulated it so well in that section of the phenomenology and the master-slave relation. So what does this mean? I don't exist without you and your recognition of me, and yet we live in these gated communities and we isolate ourselves. And I live in Boston, which is, I'm just for a few years now, which is startling to me with its segregation. Boston? So I think perhaps we are, in fact, facing a crisis right now, a worldwide crisis, and a crisis here. We have a movement of massive population transfers that we haven't seen since the end of World War II, of refugees. I think one small place to begin is by recognizing the terrible fear that Muslim parents have that their children are going to be seduced into some kind of radicalism, and that they will lose their own children, that their own children may run off and become murderers. That's a terrible, haunting fear. But I think that that fear is something that might become the basis for some kind of commonality, some kind of joint work, some friendship, to recognize what a horrible thing it is to have that fear. The loss of your child is something so insane, this kind of psychosis that's gripping people. And by the way, it's not just about rhetoric. I just want to emphasize, there may be terrible words spoken, anti-Semitic words, racist words, Islamophobic words. There's a difference between words and murder. People have their biases and they can say awful things, but to actually murder is something of a different order. And I don't think it's all that simple to make a transition from one to the other, or that people become murderers because they have hate. It takes something more than that. I don't know what's going on in the minds of these people, but I feel as if a psychosis, a sickness, has invaded the world. And I think we need to come together over that and try to figure out what's going on. We have experience with it. We had experience with it with the Holocaust. Let's think about what causes people to do this and offer our support to these Muslim parents who are in terrible fear. Yes?
I want to know, as somebody in the younger generation, somebody the world's eventually going to be in our hands, what do you suggest that we do to fix this moral emergency, to solve the problem?
What do I suggest that you do? First thing I would say is study hard. Don't watch television.
Except for the weather on Channel 2.
Read books, but read really good books. Read the classics. Don't read junk. Read important books. And also, I would say, make a list of priorities, because too often our energy gets dissipated. And I see this with my students. Students get together and they'll start getting involved in a protest over something that is relatively minor and ignore things that are very big and important. So I think it's important for us to have priorities and to tackle big issues and not little ones, and to also keep in mind that certain tactics, certain methods are appropriate for one era and may not be appropriate for another. Some things belong to certain settings. And also recognize that some things require loud vocal protest, some things require sitting down and talking. And keep in mind which is the place you want to start and how you want to go about it. Yes?
To your point, all the college campuses now that are having peaceful demonstrations, I really admire the way that's being handled. And then you have some political people who get a lot of press who say it's disgusting. It seems to me that that's the way it should be. Peaceful demonstrations and with the goal of being positive.
I agree.
I applaud what's going on in the campus.
I do too. I do too. Thank you. Yes?
Yes. So I'm from the University of Houston downtown. I'm a supervisor over there. But it's been shown, you know, we've had discussions with students and things in my conversations and philosophy, political ideas and stuff. And, you know, I remember having a conversation about...
Louder.
Oh, I'm sorry. I remember having a conversation about talking about, you know, racism ain't really relevant right now. That it's, you know, people are not so racist anymore. And you know, I'm on this group me, I don't know if y'all know what that is, but it's a text message where multiple people can be on. With, you know, student body presidents at the zoo, student body president at the zoo, and other African-American student body presidents from across the country. And they send screenshots of you know, some of the hate mail, hate email, social media attacks on individuals because of their color. And, you know, I look at that and I think, wow, we like way back in older days. But what's concerning to me is this is a new generation of hate, right? These are younger people that have these same ideas. And what do we do about that? Like, how do we change that from this generation to where we can grow past, you know, the hate that we have?
Well, it's a big question. How can we end the hate? If you want to talk about students, I'll just say a couple of things. First of all, I think that universities have to be, in some sense, reorganized. So that you go to university in order to study. So there should be more contact with professors, and professors have to take a more active role in students' lives. There's too much administration and too much money spent on the gym and not enough money spent on close relationships between students and faculty, which really, ultimately, that's, I think, what students really want, to have a mentor, a professor. They come back, they come back and they want advice, or they want a letter of recommendation, or they invite you to their wedding. And that's wonderful. It's wonderful for them. It's a gift that they have a professor in their lives forever. So I'd like to start with that. Now I have to also just say, on the other hand, one other thing, which is, you know, students, undergraduates, do a lot of weird things that normal human beings don't do. They stay up all night, they fool around in bad ways, they drink to excess, et cetera, and they eat too much pizza, and they drink alcohol and beer, and they get drunk, and they have inappropriate sexual relationships, et cetera. We know that. So, to some extent, we have to understand that we're dealing with people of a certain age, and they need to be spoken of a little differently and dealt with in a way that's a little different from somebody who is, let's say, 25 and, you know, already starting a life and has a job, etc. But yes, I agree with you. I'm horrified by some of the things that have been going on in the last year or two. I agree. What can we do? We have to talk. I think we have to talk, and I think we have to have voice of authority. And I also think kids come with the authority of their parents that can be very damaging. How do we counter that? Yeah. In the back, I think there's
I have two things to say. The answer to your question and the answer to your question is forgiveness and love, and that's it. And then the other thing is, could you give us the list of that reading material that you so much recommend? Could you just rattle it off again so I can write it down?
Okay, so I mean, there are a lot of things to read, but Michelle Alexander published a book 2-3 years ago called The New Jim Crow. And I think that's an important book. It's the kind of book where I want to memorize every page. The other book is called Between the World and Me. And the author's name is Ta-Nehisi Coates. It's Coates is C-O-A-T-E-S. Ta-Nehisi is T-A-N-E-H-E-S-I. But if you just look up C-O-A-T-E-S, Between the World and Me, you'll find it right away. And his book was nominated for a National Book Award. And tonight the decision is being announced. It's very exciting. But there are many, many other excellent books to read. I just mentioned those two. Yes? Yes?
I have one thing to say. As a suggestion, get to know each other. You've got sides in these issues, and if you just get people from both sides, if you learn that you're all human beings and you're really not that different, I think it's a matter of dialogue and becoming friends. And it's easier to say than do, but I think that would help.
I think that would be very helpful. I agree. Thank you. That's great.
Thank you so much, Dr. Heschel, and thank you all for coming this evening. Very thought-provoking, and it makes me want to go right back to college. I could never get into Dartmouth, but what the heck? I could always dream. A lot of folks at Dartmouth couldn't have gotten into Arizona State University either, so there. As this evening comes to a close, and on behalf of the museum, please allow me to thank each and every one of you for your presence here this evening, your generosity, your support, your commitment to help in teaching future generations the dangers of hatred and of prejudice and apathy. Thank you all for coming. Be safe going home, and good night.